The Bride of Frankenstein is, to me, hands down, the best of the Universal monster films. And I've seen a vast majority of the classic Universal Monsters series. I think there's about 30 movies in that series from the 1920s to the 1950s. And as of today, I've seen all of them except for a couple of the Abbott and Costello ones. But Bride of Frankenstein just stands out to me as the most memorable, the most poignant, and just personally speaking, my all-around favorite of the series for many reasons I'd like to dive into. I did a very basic review of this film a few years ago on my channel, and honestly, I didn't do it justice. So I'm delisting that one and coming back again for another rewatch, and I'd like to do a little bit of a deeper dive this time. I'll start with an overview of the film, spoiler-free of course, and then I'll offer some closing thoughts and analysis of the film. Well, Bride of Frankenstein opens up with that Universal logo, and then we go right into that epic, jarring Franz Waxman score. It's such good music. It's initially creepy, but then there's some teasingly romantic strings. And I love when we get to the list of actors in the film, with the monster's mate posted with a question mark. So we get into the film, and it's a rainy night, and we see an eerie castle, but no, this isn't Dr. Frankenstein's lab, but instead we go in and we see it's a cozy fireside. There's actor Gavin Gordon as Lord Byron, kind of chewing up the scenery with his acting as he commends Mary Shelley, played by actress Elsa Lanchester, for her Frankenstein story. And my oh my, there's something so familiar looking about her face. Whatever could it be? Also there is her husband. It's Percy Shelley, played by Douglas Watson, and after a very quick recap of events of, essentially, the story of the first Frankenstein film, we find out from her that this wasn't the end of the story at all, and she begins to tell the continuation of the narrative. So after the mill had burned up and the villagers had all assumed that the monster was dead, we find out that might not actually be the case at all. We see actress Una O'Connor, who seems to be especially pleased that the monster is gone. But is he?
Glad to see the monster roasted to death before my very eyes. It's too good for him.
Well, a poor villager missteps and falls into the water of the flooded mill cellar. And there, the Frankenstein monster is waiting, played of course by legendary actor Boris Karloff. Uh-oh, it's not looking good for this guy. And Una O'Connor also seems a little bit alarmed to see the monster back again. Well, the villagers, meanwhile, have returned the body of Henry Frankenstein, actor Colin Clive, back to his grieving fiancée Elizabeth, played by actress Valerie Hobson. Everyone thinks the doctor is dead from the events of the first film, but no, apparently he has revived. He's just not doing very well. But after some bed rest, he seems to be recovering, although he seems to be questioning if he did the right thing in creating that monster. Could it be part of the divine plan, he wonders. Well, Elizabeth hears all of this and cautions him that it is wrong what he did. Listen to her, Henry. But soon, Dr. Pretorius arrives, his old college professor and mentor, and he is expertly played in this film by Ernest Thesiger. And what a presence. What an entrance. Even the music suggests that this guy is a little bit creepy.
Dr. Pretorius.
Baron Frankenstein now, I believe.
His character is so over the top and theatrical in this film, and I love it. My business with you is private, he says snobbishly, and Elizabeth leaves a room so he can talk to Henry alone. Turns out that he wants to work again with Frankenstein. He is intrigued by his work on this creature, and he wants to work together as fellow scientists. Pretorius shares that he has created life of his own, and later, Henry goes to check it out at his lab, and Pretorius toasts to a new world of gods and monsters. He then arrives with his creation, and the film just gets a little bit silly at this point, as he brings out some glass containers with tiny little people inside of it. It's actually kind of a funny scene as you watch this tiny little king who tries to make his way out of a jar to get to a queen. And, you know, for 1935, I'll admit, there's some pretty cool special effects here. It's a goofy detour, but then we get back on track as this Pretorius wants to collaborate with Henry Frankenstein to create a mate for the monster. Meanwhile, the monster has made his way into a forest. He's looking a little rough from that mill fire. Takes a drink and some water, he sees his reflection and splashes it away in rage. He's discovered by some townspeople as a girl is screaming at seeing him, and he tries to flee, but a large mob has gathered, and they capture him again. They bind him up and they bring him back. He's in a jail cell and he's locked up in chains. But come on, that's not going to last long. Chains can't bind the Frankenstein monster. He breaks free almost right away, tears down the door, and is out on the loose again. So he's off in the woods, and he sees some tasty meat that's being cooked by some gypsies, and he moves in to grab it, but he burns his hand in the fire and then in fear runs away. But later, as the monster is moving through the woods alone, he hears the sound of a violin, and it's kind of a soothing sound, and he goes and he follows it and discovers an old man living alone in a cabin. This hermit, played by actor O.P. Heggie, is a blind man and lets the monster in, unaware of his fearsome appearance. He tries to communicate with him and just believes that the monster is unable to speak as he himself is unable to see.
This is bread. Bread. Huh? Bread. Huh?
We shall be friends, he says, and the hermit is grateful in his prayers for this unexpected arrival of this visitor. They eat and they drink together. They even share a smoke. It's actually kind of a bittersweet scene as the monster seems to have a momentary shelter and a little bit of compassion from this unexpected friend. But things were going pretty well, but then two hunters show up, lost in the woods, and they stop to ask for help, and they discover the monster, and then chaos ensues. And by the way, check it out. One of the hunters here is a young John Carradine, who would go on to play Dracula in later Universal roles. Well, there's a big fight with the men, the cabin catches ablaze, and the monster moves on. He heads to a cemetery to hide out and heads into a crypt. Now, while hiding here, he just happens to encounter this Dr. Pretorius character and some of his assistants, one of whom, Carl, is played by none other than actor Dwight Fry, previously of the last Frankenstein film and also of Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Well, Dr. Pretorius is looking for a recently deceased woman to use to create a mate for the monster. His helpers leave, and the doctor stays to eat and drink some wine with the skeletons while laughing. Well, Dr. Pretorius befriends the Frankenstein monster, gives him some food and drink, and tells him he plans to make a woman for him, and the monster seems to like this idea. Meanwhile, Henry and Elizabeth have been married, and they are preparing to leave town for a trip. Henry wants nothing to do with Pretorius and his crazy schemes, so Dr. Pretorius brings in the monster, who is now apparently doing his bidding. The monster sneaks in and grabs Elizabeth. Henry discovers it's the doing of Dr. Pretorius, of course. The monster takes Elizabeth away, and since Henry has no option, he agrees to do this experiment in order to get her back. And so, it's on. But as they work on this new body, the heart is defective, so Carl is deployed to get another through murderous means. Dr. Frankenstein is weary, but he pushes on. The monster seems to be growing impatient, so Dr. Pretorius gives him a drink to knock him out. Both doctors continue with their work with these weird angled shots. It's really great as the two of them go about their devious work, accompanied by this incessant beat of the heart that we hear. I think it's a sound of a bass drum in the orchestra. I'm not sure, but that's what it sounds like, just this boom, boom, boom. The night air is a stormy one, so they plan the reanimation with an artificial brain inside this new creature. And as the electricity crackles outside, they deploy the kites to grab this energy. They get a jolt of electricity that they needed, and they bring her down, and soon enough, she's alive, alive! And the bandages are removed, and the bride is animated.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
And then the original Frankenstein monster arrives to meet his bride. And with only a very little bit of time left, this is an ending you need to see for yourself if you haven't. I'm not going to spoil it because it is an epic conclusion as the two meet. But let me wrap this one up. Bride of Frankenstein from 1935 picks up right where the original Frankenstein of 1931 left off. It was directed by James Whale, who also directed the original Frankenstein film. The cinematography was by John J. Mescal. Many different writers worked on this script under the title The Return of Frankenstein. The story is that producer Carl Laemmle Jr. wanted a sequel to the original Frankenstein, but director James Whale wasn't interested in making another Frankenstein film. But Whale eventually agreed to do it, but only if they could have complete creative control. And what we ended up with was a story that went far beyond Mary Shelley's original. And my thoughts on this film is I love the story here. Yes, it's a sequel, but it can also easily stand on its own alone. It's just a wild continuation of the first. Almost like how you can view Rocky 1 and Rocky 2 together. It's moving ahead with the story, bringing back some of the same characters, answering the question of what happens with the monster. And is it possible for this reanimated monster to find peace or companionship, or possibly even a mate? And to really drive the story and bring about the return to the diabolical laboratory setting and more of that mad science is this Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius, who I thought was just perfect as this crazy scientist. He almost surpasses Colin Clive as far as mad scientists go, in terms of how nutty he is here. With this, the most recent viewing of the film, and I've seen this several times, I couldn't help but notice how much more prominent and how important his character is in this film. And what a complete oddball he was. The heavy shadows and the weird angled shots just accent his complete lunacy. Here in the story, it's a little tragic as Henry Frankenstein is given another chance earlier in the story to turn from his mad scientist ways, leave it all behind and marry the lovely Elizabeth, when this crazy old professor shows up at the worst time possible and drags him back into the same insanity again of creating monsters. And this Ernest Thesiger is just so over the top in his performance, just ridiculously theatrical in the role, and I just loved it. Even when he's just chilling with the Frankenstein monster in a tomb with a bottle of wine, every time he's on the screen, it's just great. I really loved him as an actor in this film. Now, speaking of the scene in the tomb, this leads to my thoughts about the musical score for this film by legendary composer Franz Waxman. And his music for this movie is just so good. For me, especially, for this particular scene, when Dr. Pretorius is in the tomb and he's laughing and enjoying his little picnic, the music we hear for the scene, it's titled the Dance Macabre. It's just wonderful. These kind of eerie, jarring piano notes that they almost make me think of like skeletons dancing. I don't know how to describe it, but it's so perfect for this scene.
I give you the monster.
And in listening to the opening credit music again, listen to those creepy four notes, and it's almost like a distorted version of Beethoven's Fifth. But here, it's not the clean and orderly dun 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 dun, but instead it's like a ba 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 ba, like musically we're hearing a flawed replica of Beethoven, kind of like how the Frankenstein monster represents a flawed human being. Anyhow, I've got the full score linked below, and it is worth listening to. This is one fantastic musical soundtrack. And Boris Karloff is just perfect here as he returns to the tragic role of the monster. He looks much the same as the first Frankenstein film, but maybe a little more battle damaged, a little singed by fire, and he even clutches a gunshot wound in his arm. His appearance in the film is, again, horrifying and yet pitiable, maybe more so than the first film. I don't know, I find myself feeling sorry for him when he's captured and he's chained up with virtually no one willing to understand him. And when he briefly finds a place of rest and peace with the old man out in the woods, it's actually kind of sad when this is taken away from him so quickly. You want his character to find some kind of peace, but you know it's not going to happen. He can't stay there forever hiding. Eventually, he's going to be seen by someone somewhere, and he'd be off on the run again. The Frankenstein monster has this strange, reanimated brain, almost like a child, with the ability to speak some words and has a little bit of comprehension. And it's almost like as you watch the film, this communication starts to improve as we draw closer to the end of the film. Almost like his brain is starting to get a little better. I don't know, at least that's how I read it watching this. Does he or will he eventually piece together what he once was? You know, will his memory continue to restore? It's just one of those things I like to think about. Like, what would have happened if the monster had been able to stay at the cabin in peace and slowly reconnect to what he was? What if the old man had started asking him questions? Who are you? Who were you before? And you know, I don't know, but it's stuff like this I think about when I watch a film like this. I love a film that kind of gets you thinking, and there were some really interesting things that you could take away from this film watching it. Now, Elsa Lanchester, you'll notice, isn't in the film very much. She's just at the very beginning and at the ending. And although she's briefly in the film, both of the times we see her in this film in those different roles are really great, especially at the end. I love seeing her as the bride with that wild, animated mannerism she portrays as the new monster. I mean, to me, it's frankly horrific. All those scars on her face and things. You know, she just kind of turns and growls and hisses. And it was said that her spitting, hissing performance was inspired by the swans in Regent's Park, London. And I have to comment about the gorgeous sets of this film. I mean, this is just visually such a treat. You know, you see these large vaulted castle interiors lit with candles. You see dreary, watery mill cellars. You see the fire, the sparks and the smoke of a laboratory and so on. John J. Metcalf's cinematography is just so perfect here, just capturing that unreal universe of reanimated monsters, treading through dark forests and sinister tombs and so on. And I love just the crazy stilted angles and bizarre contrast that we see near the end of the film, especially as both scientists are working together to reanimate the bride. So this really is a great film. I mean, there's just so much I take away from it every time I watch. The story is one of themes of loneliness and rejection, of just longing for friendship and understanding. The monster, you feel sorry for him. He just wants a little kindness, and that seems to be impossible for him to find. The film balances horror with suspense, romance, humor, and it leads up to that doomed encounter between these two artificial beings that were never meant to be. As the monster said, "Made me from dead, I love dead, hate living." As mentioned at the beginning, this is my favorite of the Universal monster films, and it's always a treat to revisit. I had to come back and share a few more thoughts, and who knows, maybe in a few years, I'll be back to review it again. Who knows? I do whatever I want on this channel. Universal's Frankenstein series continued with 6 more movies after this, with Boris Karloff only playing him once more in Son of Frankenstein in 1939, which also featured Bela Lugosi as Igor. And if you haven't seen it, gotta mention it, Mel Brooks does a hilarious parody of the blind hermit scene in his movie Young Frankenstein from 1974, 40 years later, with Gene Hackman as the blind hermit character. "Wait, where are you going? I was going to make espresso." Anyhow, that's my review and thoughts of Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. It's a Universal classic monster film, most definitely one worth checking out.